Well, good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this latest in a series of webcasts around world-class finance. Today we're discussing issues around the record-to-report cycle, and we have similar events planned and in the works for the procure-to-pay or source-to-settle, depending on terminology, and customer-to-cash. Today we're talking about getting to a safer, faster, better close. So thank you for joining us. We have people from all around the world, from North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. So thank you for joining us and taking time that's for some of you is an unpleasant time of day. My name is Dan French. I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. I've met many of you previously, and I know some of you follow our work quite closely, and many of you are clients. I'm joined today by David Mitchell, who's our Executive Vice President of Transformation and Finance Process Optimization. David is a former CFO and has led transformation programs and set up shared service centers, and he's also led the team that's developed some of the concepts and methodologies you'll hear about today. So welcome, David.
Thanks, Dan, and I'd like to add my welcome to Dan's. Thank you for joining us.
So many of you know a little bit about Consider Solutions, but just a few words on us. As I said previously, we are focused on the journey to world-class finance, where we help, as a finance function, we help drive business results in the right direction, help minimize the cost of finance, optimize the cash flow position, and make sure we have effective risk management for the organization. We operate 3 lines of business. Many of you know us through the work we do in financial control and compliance, broader work in risk assurance around fraud, waste and error, and other compliance programs. But today we're very much talking about process optimization in the finance process, particularly record to report. We provide a various set of services, as you can see below, around each of these cycles. Many of you know our clients, many of you are with our clients, so here's some logos. Again, these clients operate in the Americas, Europe, and Asia, so you know many of those names. Just to put a bit of context for today, we're talking about the record to report cycle. Of course, in the old days, we just called this a financial close. But you can see this schematic around the record to report cycle as we describe it today. We're very much looking at this through the basic processing, the close cycle, consolidation, and reporting. And this is what David particularly will be sharing best practices and insights over. So in terms of agenda, we've got introduced ourselves. I would like just to say we do want your questions as we go through. So please ask questions as you go through the process. As things pop up into your head, you can enter your questions in the panel on the screen in front of you. Please do them as you go so you don't forget, and we'll endeavor to answer them at the end. If we don't have time to answer all of them, we'll deal with those by email. And if you have any technical problems with the service, again, enter a question, and someone will get back to you. David's going to share some perspectives on the challenge in the last mile of finance, that record to report cycle, what makes it complicated, and some of the strategies we have observed and developed to address performance and control gap. And then we have the Q&A. This is a 40-minute session, so hopefully you'll find it useful, and certainly some insights we're keen to share. So with that, I'll pass you over to David. David.
Thanks very much, Dan. Let's start the session with a familiar slide. This slide is from the Hackett Group, and what it shows is that finance has improved considerably over the last decade. In particular, it shows that one of the reasons we quote for the improvement is the use of ERP systems, shared services, and outsourcing. But what you will notice on this slide is that the gap between world-class and peer, or what we call the best and the rest, has increased over time. Another thing that you may also notice is that during 2 periods of extreme change and volatility, Sarbanes-Oxley and the financial crisis, the world-class, the best finance functions took this very much in their stride and continued the steady path of improvement. Whereas the rest, the majority of finance functions, their costs went up, they burned resources at a higher rate as they were adjusting to these changes. So the gap between the best and the rest is increasing, and the best are more resilient to volatility and change. But the biggest gap is actually in the record to report process. So whilst there's a big gap between the best and the rest in finance overall, this is particularly seen in the record-to-report process. And what this slide illustrates from the Hackett Group is that around the general accounting and external reporting, or what we call the record-to-report process, the level of standardization that's been achieved and the progress that's been made in driving out complexity around general ledger accounting and reporting is a lot. There's a lot bigger gap between the best and the rest in general ledger and accounting than there is on the other finance processes. For those organizations that haven't made major progress in the record-to-report area, the R2R improvement is a very high item on the agenda of CFOs. So we're going to be looking at the record-to-report process today. There's a big prize in record-to-report in terms of control, efficiency and effectiveness. And as I have said, there's a big gap between the best and the rest. The record-to-report process is pretty common across most organizations, regardless of the industry, in terms of the things that need to be achieved. And there's a number of established best practices and a number of tools which are applicable to all organizations. So there's a lot that we can learn from the best, and it's particularly applicable in the record-to-report process. So we're going to be looking at the common complexities that we face in the record-to-report process and how those impact our ability to get to a safer, faster and better close. We're going to be looking at the underlying root causes, some of the best practices that the leading finance functions have implemented, the kinds of enabling tools that people have used to drive performance and control, some of the key measures and metrics that people use to judge their performance on the record-to-report process, and how leading finance functions go about planning and sustaining the journey. Before we go into the details, I'd like to make a couple of points. The first one is that transforming the record-to-report process is more of a marathon than a sprint. In fact, it's a forever journey. As we go through the presentation, you'll see that a number of the best practices boil down to a set of things. In particular, simplifying the end-to-end process and addressing legacy complexity. You'll see that coming up during the presentation. Standardizing coding structures, policies, procedures, and even key roles is a common theme that comes up. Finance closed task management tools, that's a new and interesting area where highly labor-intensive tools are being automated, greater control is being placed over spreadsheets and documents. We'll be talking more about that. Another interesting area that's going to come up is the appointment of global process owners and the building of process communities. We're seeing that more and more, especially in the leading finance organizations. And finally, formalizing the whole continuous improvement cycle.
Great, thanks David for that introduction. It's very clear we're in the right area here, since this area of record-to-report is the biggest gap between the best and the rest. So, so what are the real challenges, David?
That's a good question, Dan. I'm glad you asked that, because that's what I'm about to answer. The slide shows quite a lot of complexity here. Ad hoc movement of paper, lots of arrows going in different directions. Diverse ways of working have been developed over time, and we have very experienced people working on the record-to-report process who are familiar with their own particular ways of working. It's highly manual and paper-based, but there's a dependency on these experienced people. And it's hard to deploy resources flexibly when only a small number of people know exactly their own particular way of working. We also see a creative use of spreadsheets, and it never ceases to amaze me just how creative finance can be in using spreadsheets and developing amazing macros without any input or support from IT to help them with their own particular tasks. The problem with this is that these are personal tools that support their own specific ways of working, and other people around them don't necessarily know how they work. audit in this kind of situation, both internal and external audit becomes a lot more laborious and labor intensive. So what we're seeing in this picture is a paper chase across a number of different silos and a group of people who have great expertise about what they do in their particular area of the process, but limited views about what happens across the process as a whole. In fact, I would describe it as a hero culture. It's a hero culture of catching near misses, of hitting near impossible deadlines. It's a hero culture of late nights and high stress. Problem is that we don't judge success by the effort and the heroism. We judge it by the outcomes and what it costs to get us those outcomes. And what this slide shows is that the cost of running the record-to-report process in the best is half that of the rest. It also shows that the time taken for the best, which is under 2 weeks, and in some cases substantially under 2 weeks, is half that of the rest, which is somewhere between somewhere around 4 weeks plus or minus a few days. And to make matters worse, the best use half the resources of the rest. And the best have done a number of things, which are indicated below. In particular, they've controlled and rationalized the size of the chart of accounts. So a lot of work has been done optimizing the chart of accounts, and in particular, managing its growth and controlling its growth. In addition, Six Sigma type approaches and Six Sigma goals are being achieved in things like getting tasks right the first time, using task management systems, and addressing things like materiality. So making sure that journal entries, for example, that process adjustments after the close are only the material ones, the ones that have to go through. Use of reconciliation management tools as well, and having every account that needs to be reconciled handled through a reconciliation management system. Those are the kinds of things that the best are doing that have enabled them to get the tremendous improvement in performance and control versus the rest.
So that's a very good insight into what the gap is and therefore what the prize is we can aim for. But I guess because record-to-report is the biggest divergence between the best and the rest, clearly there's some complexity. So let's talk about what that complexity is made up of.
Okay. Our UK listeners will be aware of Clapham Junction, which is the UK's busiest station. But for those of you who aren't aware of it, Clapham Junction is organised chaos. Trains rushing in and out, commuters rushing all over the place. The close-to-report process has been likened to being the accounting equivalent of Clapham Junction. It's where everything converges. There's high volume of movement, lots of people running around in a hurry, and failure at critical points causes bottlenecks and delays. This space is also the final checkpoint where diligent controllers meticulously catch previously undetected errors. It's also the place where diverse legacy systems and data structures converge and get turned into a coherent, true and fair view for external reporting purposes, and also into meaningful insight for internal management processes. So this is a complicated area, and it's complicated because it's difficult. And some of the areas of difficulties are these. I mean, it's difficult to embed quality at source. It's difficult to continually redesign and drive an excellent end-to-end process, which is highly automated, when the business model is often changing and the environment in which the business is operating is changing. It's difficult because there's a heavy dependence on key talent. It's been likened to establishing the right foundations after the walls have gone up, or fine-tuning an engine while it's driving at speed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through the record-to-report value chain and look at some of the details as to why it's complicated. So the first point I want to make is getting it right first time, on time, at source, and keeping it right down the line is challenging. And we've got some examples here of the kinds of things that crop up to make that difficult. Posting errors in multiple different business units. If they haven't been detected at the time of the close, diligent controllers further down the line, if they're material, are looking out for them. Late purchase orders and invoice approval. Doing accruals at the last moment. All of these things add complexity. In particular, if you have an accounting system where the sub-ledgers are not highly integrated with the general ledger, then we have to watch out for those being out of balance and out of sequence. One of my favorites is the last-minute billing. It's the quarter end. We need to get our sales up so everyone can get their bonuses. All of these things put pressure on a very small window in which the close has to be managed and the results have to be published. Lack of discipline around the close calendar is another problem, and where deadlines are not enforced, last-minute adjustments, and of course foreign currency re-evaluation. These are all things that make getting it right the first time at source and down the line critical. The next area, as we move down the value chain, is the whole end-to-end process design, driving standardization and automation. And this shows on the right of the screen the kinds of things that crop up as problems. Intercompany is an area which is purely internal. So if we have problems within intercompany, it's a bit of an own goal, but intercompany is a common issue in making the close process difficult. There are disagreements on recharges, the processing is often out of phase, and a lack of a procedure to resolve issues in a prompt way creates a lot of hassle around the close process. Also, heavy reliance on manual methods of reconciling accounts using multiple Excel spreadsheets which only a few people understand how they work, poor data integrity, and lack of transparency and accountability. There needs to be visibility of what tasks need to be done and what the status of those tasks is and who's accountable for them. And often that's missing. We've talked about standard coding structures and so on, but a non-standard chart of accounts and multiple systems, and in particular non-standard policies, all of these things create pressure and make the month-end process complicated. When we get down to the reporting cycle at the end, what we're seeing is we have highly skilled and expensive people doing routine tasks and acting as the point of fixing problems that should have been got right in the first place. So we have multiple manual iterations of producing reports, multiple versions of the truth, and critically, very little time to spend on essential analysis. Large volumes of reports, and often these are handled through Excel spreadsheets again. So underpinning this process, there are what we call the foundations of the process. So processes, procedures, policies, coding structures, where we've actually put the process, the underlying controls, how we ensure compliance, the key performance indicators, and our dashboard and how we make sure that we've got visibility, the intelligent and effective use of automation tools, the deployment of skills and talent, and organization and governance, making sure that we can look down the process and understand who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. And when we look at the initiatives that the leading organizations take, they tend to do things, the things outlined in the box to the right. They're driving standardization. They're looking at the effective use of shared services, in particular unbundling the more routine tasks and putting those into shared services and keeping the more specialist services, aspects of the process closer to the business and closer to group. Front-end automated controls, transparency with dashboards and alerts, letting people know when tasks are coming up which are urgent and chasing them when they haven't. Effective systems integration and enabling tools, and talent planning, particularly being able to manage resources flexibly and to deploy them in response to where the effort is needed. And of course, accountability and discipline.
Great, so that's definitely looking at the complexity. So let's look at some of the insights and best practices and some of the tools that your team have developed to help us with this.
Okay, yes, I'd like to look at this in 4 areas, as you can see on the slide. Addressing structural complexity, we've talked a bit about that already. We refer to it as structural complexity because it involves changing systems, changing processes, gaining consensus across the enterprise on ways of working. And the leading organizations have spent a lot of time hitting those basic foundations right. There's two areas we're seeing a lot more these days. One is around process managing the report-to-report process itself, using task management tools. And the second is the emergence of global process owners and process communities to drive continuous improvement. And what these organizations are doing is systematically looking at their capability, the capability of how they build performance and control. And I'm going to talk a little bit initially about how we use capability and maturity models to understand the capability that we need to build in order to drive the performance that we're looking for. So this diagram outlines in brief the Consider Solutions capability maturity model, and I'm going to talk you through the logic of it. The way leading organizations use tools like capability maturity models is to look at where they stand in their capability in terms of somewhere on the scale of weak to strong, and they assess how important it is for them to close those gaps and what kind of best practices they can implement in order to close that gap, and what effect, most importantly, that will have on performance. So just briefly looking at the logic of this, the first part of it is service definition. And it's really important to be clear on what is needed, for who and by when, and importantly, why. Why is it that we need to do these particular tasks? What's the value add? Are we driving value-added activities, or are we doing things that don't really need to be done? So real clarity around service definition is the start point, and who it matters to. And having a process which is well designed and standardized based on relevant best practices, which will actually deliver the outcomes that are required by all the stakeholders of the process. The next part is where I actually put that process, making effective use of captive and outsourced shared service centers and centers of excellence, using the appropriate skills in the appropriate places. Then there's building the effective controls and compliance. So what's the scope of controls activity and ability to control related issues? Things like the use of automated controls monitoring. And the KPIs that we use and the dashboards that we have in place in order to make sure that the process is working and the controls are in place. And then it's how do we underpin that process with automation and enabling technology? How do we use standardized and integrated tools to simplify and streamline the process? And how do we manage the skills and talent? So it's the talent management strategy that we need for attracting, retaining, and deploying the right kind of people and developing them, and flexibility of resourcing so that we can deploy resources where the effort is needed, and that we've got them in the right centers. So we are getting labor arbitrage as well as using scarce talent. Then there's organization and governance. What's being effective and efficient in our spans of control, having clear and robust segregation of duties, and being able to look down the process and be clear about who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted and involved. And a new area and a new philosophy around managing a process is to manage it with the stakeholders in mind as if they are paying customers, which ultimately they are. But to manage stakeholder satisfaction, to be able to match supply of resource to the demand for the work, and to put in process owners and a process of continuous improvement. And finally, there's managing the whole risk around all of the above. Unfortunately, complexity isn't something that is a one-off thing to address. New complexity is always arising. And what this diagram shows is that we need a process for turning complexity gradually into streamlined, simple ways of working, so it becomes more of a commodity. So when we start dealing with complexity, it's very expensive. Once we've re-engineered the process and addressed that complexity, it ceases to be a mystery, and it becomes a standard way of working, which is much closer to a commoditized process. So one of the things that people are doing in the leading organizations is that they're recognizing this and systematically driving a journey of addressing complexity, standardizing, simplifying, making best use of shared services and enabling systems, codifying what needs to be done, and then turning that into a streamlined process. So standardizing and simplifying coding structures, automating with standard systems and tools, those are all important things that people have been doing in addressing structural complexity. And I'm going to give you a few examples around intercompany, the general ledger, fixed assets, and reporting. So the first area is intercompany, and rationalizing the corporate structure, reducing the number of companies within the organization has a tremendous effect on the issues associated with intercompany. So does automating intercompany transactions, actually doing both sides of the accounting entries on a single system prevents them getting out of phase. Having a standard set of intercompany policies and procedures which are accessible and are enforced makes a lot of sense as well, and drives out some of the unnecessary complexity. One of the things that the leading companies do is to pre-approve non-recurring intercompany charges. So rather than leave it to after the close to get these things sorted out, they're sorted out up front. In addition, they use an automated resolution and escalation procedure with a clear set of rules and structures which are enforced in a robust way. Having clear accountability for each intercompany account and the reconciliation of it is also a best practice. And we've talked about materiality elsewhere, but materiality thresholds, particularly on intercompany, are again important. Moving on to the general ledger. Standard charts of accounts, having really clear definitions of accounting treatments and policies, and having those enforced across the enterprise makes the whole process a lot easier. Integrating sub-ledgers with the general ledger prevents the sub-ledgers getting out of phase with the general ledger, and again removes the need for reconciling things which have stayed in line in any case. Using predetermined estimates for allocations and adjusting periodically rather than trying to do it to the nearest decimal point, again, makes the whole process a lot easier. And using exception reporting and integrated front-end controls reduces risks and captures errors at source rather than leaving it to a diligent controller to pick up on it later. Standard accounting policies and procedures supported by training, again, a best practice, makes a huge difference to the organization in terms of how efficiently and effectively the process works. Having an enterprise accounting calendar with standard tasks and cut-off dates and enforcing it, and reinforcing that with automated systems, with alerts and reminders, all of those things drive a more efficient process. Having standard procedures for preparing, approving and reviewing reconciliations and certifying tasks, again, makes a lot of difference. Having a standard risk-based approach to reconciliation and analysis of accounts, that's another best practice. Why spend time on the low-risk accounts. Why not prioritize the high-risk accounts first, get those out of the way, and then move on to the lower-risk accounts subsequently. Fixed assets is an interesting one and a challenge. Having to reconcile, verify, and validate fixed assets. Having a standard fixed asset system across the whole enterprise, again, makes a lot of difference, as does having common capitalization policies, and in particular being able to use those systems to do both local GAAP and IFRS. A high level of integration between the fixed asset register and other subledgers, for example, the purchase ledger, again makes a huge difference to the number of discrepancies and things that might need to be reconciled during the close process. And having that level of integration prevents the need for solving the problem further down the line. Asset capitalization materiality limits, balanced with the need to track assets, again, makes a big difference. So when it comes to reporting, I was talking earlier about the fact that we use expensive talent to fix problems, and they don't have enough time to spend on the analysis. But structurally, the more we rationalize the reports and do so regularly, the less work that there is for controllers to do, and having appropriate reporting tools, not basing it on Excel, but having reporting tools that are secure and support multiple users. All of those things are important best practices that have made a big impact. One area that is important as well is the whole management narrative that goes with the accounts, and starting the narrative as the information becomes available in draft and then doing final edits is a lot more effective than doing it all at the last moment. Then there's the use of tools in process managing the record-to-report process. Because the record-to-report process is a regular quarterly, monthly, annual process, it lends itself to task management. In particular, assigning tasks to individuals, having a hierarchy of tasks, moving from preparers to approvers to reviewers, and utilizing workflow and automatic alerts and reminders as well as dashboards. Using account reconciliation tools and standard templates for different types of reconciliation is not only more efficient, but it enables you to link the templates to policies and procedures, and because they're standard, you can deploy different resources without them having to learn a particular person's methodology. So it drives a standard methodology. Often Excel spreadsheets are bravely used to do large-scale transaction matching, but there are much better tools available that can do transaction matching in a very accurate and incredibly controlled way. Being able to control adjusting journal entries and to keep the general ledger in line with the final reports. Again, there are tools available that make managing that in a secure environment so much easier. Document management and spreadsheet control is often an area that gets audit comments, spreadsheets in particular, because there's a lack of documentation around them, and people are not sure how accurate they are and when they become subject to errors. Document management and version control, again, very, very important. Do we have the final documents available that support the close and the certification? Where are they? So having digitized documents in a secure database, so much more effective and efficient than the old binder method. And being able to enforce segregation of duties in an effective and an efficient way. So identifying who's able to prepare something, who's able to approve it, who's able to review it, and to know that that's what's happened, because that's what the workflow system determines. Having the visibility of progress, dashboards on status, and being in a position to reallocate resources to drive process, and finally having the metrics and the information after the month end to tell you what was right first time, where did we have the problems, how much time and effort did we spend on particular things. That's a good feed into continuous improvement. So good practices around process management, the R2R. Managing the whole preparer, approver, and review roles, risk profiling accounts, so looking at accounts and determining the criteria for high and medium and low risk, and then prioritizing on that basis. Risk-based task prioritization with clear start and end dates, and scheduling the high risk, high priority tasks ahead of the rest. Using standard reconciliation templates and encapsulating in those best practices and policies and procedures. Being in a position to have team-based assignments with single point of accountability, so we can flex resources and know that regardless of who is doing the work, it's going to be done in the same way and controlled in the same way. Intelligent use of materiality thresholds, being in a position to automatically, for example, reconcile certain accounts that are within a given threshold, and really importantly, this whole controlled digitized documents and moving away from binders and having a controlled certification process. So one of our mantras is that performance and control are two sides of the same coin, and many best practices that support good performance also support good control, and vice versa. And this is an example of one here with a digitized documentation and controlled certification process. It's more efficient, and it's also a much stronger control. And then there's having a controlled accounting timetable with real-time reporting, dashboard, and status monitoring. So this diagram here illustrates a typical best-in-class tool for managing the record-to-report process. It provides visibility and control of the close-to-report task status. It brings in the necessary data from feeder systems, and what it does is it curates and controls the relevant data and documents. It assigns tasks and control. It controls the preparation, approval, and review of reconciliations and key tasks in the closed process. It also helps automate transaction matching and streamline reconciliation. And importantly, it enables the key players to become a high-performing team rather than individual heroes. So the final area that I wanted to mention in terms of improvement activity is process ownership and targeted continuous improvement initiatives. We've seen a lot of progress around the appointment of global process owners, and particularly in the leading organizations, global process owners and end-to-end process communities are becoming more and more prevalent. Global process owners play the role of architects of the next best practice implementation and design of the process, and they pull together a community from all the different functions along the process to drive continuous improvement. A lot of the areas of improvement actually lie on the boundary between one function and another, so having an end-to-end community that understands the whole process and is able to implement the changes is very important. That prevents us from moving the problem. We solve the problem rather than shift it. Having a regular diagnostic on that end-to-end process to identify opportunities is another good practice that global process owners are doing. So we're seeing global process owners and their end-to-end process communities at least annually defining a program of improvement based on diagnostics. with a number of initiatives, often things that can be done fairly quickly in let's say, a 6 to 8 week cycle, using agile teams from within the end-to-end process community, and measuring the benefits that they're delivering in terms of a faster, a better, safer close on a regular basis throughout the year. And we're seeing the harmonization of performance and control objectives. In the past, these were very often seen as separate. So you would see controls patched over a process rather than designed in to the process. And then you would see efforts to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of a process and the unbundling of some of the controls. So looking at the control objectives and the performance objectives of a process at the same time and designing a process that achieves both, again, these are the kinds of initiatives and philosophies that the best-in-class finance functions are following. And that meta-level process of continually improving, comparing yourself with world-class, setting tougher and tougher operating standards, assessing gaps, identifying actions and initiatives to close those gaps, and implementing them through a process community. We're seeing that becoming a meta-level process which has enabled the leading finance functions to perform at a level which has enabled them to do so at half the price in half the time. So, coming back to our hero, there is a better way, is what we're saying in conclusion. Many of the challenges of the close process can be designed out, and others can be enabled and streamlined using appropriate tools. The potential prize in catching the best is to halve the time and halve the cost, as well as reducing stress.
Thanks, David. Thank you for that tour through the strategies and insights there. We have some questions. You still have a couple of minutes to add any more questions you have in the panel. We're running short of time, so we'll just take one of these. We're going to come back to the others by email, but obvious one here. David, you've outlined a lot of initiatives and best practices. Where should you start?
That's a very good question, and I won't answer it by saying that kind of depends on where you are. But if you haven't established global process owners and built process communities, that's a really good place to start, because it creates the environment and creates the momentum and accountability to actually drive this. People are very busy with the day job, so having a group of people who are dedicating some time looking at the end-to-end process, that would be a good place to start. Another thing that I would consider as a high on my list of the first few things to do would be to run diagnostics and to have workshops with people across the end-to-end process to define the opportunity to close gaps. And if you haven't looked at some of the close task management tools on the market, that's a good thing to do as well. So those three things: process ownership, running diagnostics to identify the gaps and to prioritize them, and look at some of the tools that now are available to support the close to report process.
Thanks, David. There are a number of other questions. We're going to have to deal with those by email, I'm afraid, but thank you for your attention. If you've got, if you want to continue the discussion and have a question that's more than just a simple response, you can get hold of David and myself. The email address is there at our website. Also, in terms of diagnostic tools and support, David kind of introduced at a very high level the capability maturity model, which is several hundred points of measuring capability and identifying the priorities and moving on, which is getting a lot of interest. In terms of tools, both analytics and automation are kind of on the agenda there, so we have insights and experience with those. In terms of support, best practice, facilitation and guidance, David's team are working with that with a number of organizations around the world. So if any of that rings a bell, then you know who to get in contact with. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much for your time, whatever time of day it is with you today. Thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks a lot.